Uh, Sorry, Andrew, can we first get if they have consented for the recording and then
Yeah, I
record?
got the consent already.
Okay, okay, great. Okay, TC rejects. Can we have your speak order? Opposition team, can you please provide us your speaker order so we can begin the round?
Hey, sorry, it's been really laggy. Okay, I'm gonna type it. Actually, can I just say it to you?
Yes, yes.
Okay, first is gonna be Michael Peng, second and reply is gonna be Andy Lin, and then third is Angela.
I think their internet is very bad. I think everyone should remove the cameras so that the connection is stable. Uh, are you able to hear me
Uh,
normally or?
yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yeah, you're a bit lagging, but yeah, I think now we can
Okay.
hear you.
Okay, so it's gonna be first Michael Peng, second and reply Andy Lin, and then third speaker is gonna be Angela.
Thank you very much. Okay. Cool. You guys know the time for each speech and stuff like that. Please time yourselves. Please ask POIs, take POIs, indicate how you ask POIs to be asked. And yeah, with that said, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to open today's debate. Here.
Sorry, just to clarify, does this mean that we turn off our cameras when we speak as well?
I think it would be best that to do that way because due to connectivity issues, obviously it's better with your camera on for a more authentic experience, but I guess it's fine. I mean, if the opposition is fine with you turning your cameras on, you can do it. Opposition, are you fine with that?
Yeah, we're okay with that.
Okay, so you can turn your cameras.
Hi, can I check I'm visible and audible?
Perfectly visible and audible.
Thank you. I would like verbal POIs, please. For the past 7 decades, the political, economic, and social development of the two Koreas have gone in opposite directions. The two states have become immeasurably different, and the unfortunate reality is that the doors towards reunification have long closed. Two broken halves don't always make a whole. Propose. On proposition, as South Korea, we would officially recognize the North as an independent state rather than continue to pursue a unified Korea. A few points I've set up. First, what are both nations' existing stances on reunification? For North Korea, reunification has been stamped out of the nation's political future, being erased from the constitution and scrapping several governmental bodies tasked with promoting reunification with the South. Kim Jong-un has even gone as far as to change the status of South Korea to a separate, hostile nation. For the South, political appetite for reunification has dwindled. Only 28% of South Koreans in 2023 wanted a unified Korean peninsula because of, firstly, cultural differences. For the average South Korean that has never seen the elusive North, it is difficult to see them as anything but a separate cultural and ethnic identity. Even depictions within the media harp on these differences, emphasizing contrasts in dialects and appearances. Secondly, because of practical difficulties, even under the assumption that reunification can be achieved, it comes at a significant economic cost. This is why policies like a reunification tax remains wholly unpopular and were abandoned after public backlash. Therefore, reunification is increasingly losing its appeal in both of these territories. Secondly, what is currently being done to work towards reunification? Over the past decades, the South Korean government has invested millions into the development of infrastructure and support systems to overcome the differences between the two countries in the event of unification. This includes the construction of settlements or re-education schools for North Koreans. Beyond this, the government retains a Ministry of Reunification branch that works to promote reunification and facilitate discussions with the North. On our side, we will halt these efforts. Thirdly, what does reunification entail. A unified Korea is not just a peaceful coexistence of two separate states, but a singular, combined nation under one government. This necessitates the creation of a homogeneous workforce and economic system between the people of the two states. Finally, I want to recognize that this is an actor motion, so any argument must be made from the perspective or with the interests of only South Korea in mind. First argument then on how we protect the sovereignty of South Korea. The premise of this argument is that reunification is harmful for South Korea. Firstly, economically, the reunification means South Korea will need to spend an exorbitant amount of money continuously to make North Korea economically viable. Let's be real here. North Korea has a defunct economy. The estimated cost of reunification that the South will have to pay is $3 trillion. That is 175% of South Korea's current GDP. 60% of North Koreans live below the poverty line, and the income gap between the North and the South is 22-1. So if opposition wants to create a country without a staggeringly high degree of income inequality, they will have to do things like invest in the welfare system for an additional 25 million people. It looks like investing in an education system. It looks like investing in heavy industries and making an entire country a business-friendly environment. The way to get this money is from channeling taxpayer money from South Koreans into this whole unfamiliar territory. Politically, though, the new country is also going to be unimaginably polarized. Half the population of people in the new country, basically people in North Korea now, have already internalized 70 years of propaganda about why everyone in the other half of the country is terrible, why the political elite is out to get them, why all the problems that they face is because of South Korea. Literally, all of North Korea believes that South Korea invaded them first, and that peace talks failed because South Koreans was being uncooperative, because Kim would never want to blame the failure of these talks on himself and on his own authority. Secondly, the North and South Koreans also have very different political priorities right now. For reunification to happen, they need a massive redistribution of resources from the South to the North. This is likely to be incredibly unpopular among South Koreans, but desirable and necessary for the North Koreans. Notably, most of the people living in the North and South are people born after the Korean War, just by virtue of the fact that the war has ended 70 years ago. 70 years are equivalent to 2 entire generations of people who have grown up and lived their entire lives without ever being able to catch a glimpse of one another. 70 years ago, maybe they were a country. But in 2024, one country have developed in ways that have far outstripped the pace of the other. In one country, people expect their tax income to go back to them, not to another population as foreign as the tourists that enter their borders every day. A claim that South Koreans will be willing to forfeit their time and money for lofty conceptions of reunification is utterly absurd. The impacts are massive. In opposition's best case, they would force South Korea to turn from an economically prosperous country into a bankrupt and insolvent state. Opposition would rip up the fabric of harmony in South Korea because it forced South Koreans into a life they never wanted to live and never consented to. Opposition would impose anarchy as the political institutions of these merged territories are gridlocked and battlegrounds for a control over an identity that can never be common. This argument, therefore, proves not in the interest of South Korea to pursue reunification with the North. Before I move into my second argument, yes.
Your argument concedes that reunification is likely. Is that the stance you're going to take?
Our argument does not concede reunification is likely. We say reunification is likely to be very expensive, and even if it happens, it harms South Korea. It's on your side's burden to prove that it's likely to happen. Back to my second argument on why the process of advocating for reunification provokes further conflict. The premise of this argument is that South Korea asking for reunification prompts more aggression from North Korea. Firstly, this retrogrades peace talks. When South Korea asks for reunification with the North, the premise of this is that the North belongs to the South. The North Korea isn't a separate state, but a part of South Korean territory. Asking for a peace talk without first reunifying contradicts this position because a state cannot be at war with itself. It can only be at war and therefore necessitate a peace talk with another state. On their side of the house, to continue peace talks, they have two options. First, they either need both North and South Korea to agree to a reunification, which obviously is not to our surprise, because in 2007, the first course of the North-South Korean Summit Declaration was on planned reunification. Unfortunately, this is impossible as illustrated in setup because North Korea is unwilling to go through this process. The other option then is therefore to recognize North Korea as a sovereign state, to recognize this conflict as an interstate conflict, and therefore peace agreement can happen. This is our case that they can never claim. Secondly, opposition also further antagonizes Kim and the North Korean regime. Kim has already publicly stated that he wants to abandon reunification. The reason was that a reunified Korea is incompatible with the existence of the Kim regime. Calls for reunification from South Korea are therefore not just a refutation of Kim's own political vision. They're an affront to the legitimacy of Kim's regime, a call for his extermination. This is far more likely to prompt further aggression from North Korea. On comparative, we are far more preferable because we recognize the sovereignty of North Korea as a separate state. This means we can actually start peace negotiations and agreements on our side. And secondly, we also reduce aggression from North Korea, both in the short term and in the long term. The strategy of proposition is clear. First, we prove to you that the process of reunification retrogrades peace. And second, that even if reunification somehow happens, it destroys South Korea. Two broken halves don't always make a whole. Propose.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the first speaker from side opposition to open their side today's debate. Here.
Hi. Can you all hear me? Hello? Okay.
Yep, you're audible. Yep.
Okay. Before my speech, I'd like to thank Charlie Mee. He's a great emotional support to me. Okay. Before my speech, verbal POIs. And I'll probably take a POI before my second argument. Okay. The recognition of North Korea as a sovereign state will only fuel the fire of North and South Korean tensions. Rather than increasing the war, we choose not to be the arsonists, rather the firefighters working towards a peaceful unification. We're very proud to oppose. I'm going to give two arguments. First, on how this increases the risk of war. Second, on how this is effective planning for unification. But before that, stance and refutation. We believe that any change to the status quo policy will be seen as provocation by North Korea and could easily spiral into conflict. We believe that the long-term planning of reunification is necessary to continue to ensure a prosperous future and a peaceful future. It doesn't have to happen now, but it should happen in the future. In the status quo, we treat North Korea as a de facto state that has a de facto control over the territory and peoples within it. We would continue this and have policies to treat North Korea as a de facto state. We support current South Korean policies to continue to pursue official peaceful reunification with North Korea. We think that people actively want reunification. It's because they're socially and culturally been taught to want reunification in their schools. It's because North Korea has many benefits that South Korea is actively looking for. And recent polls of declining support aren't entirely accurate, not at the moment. People who opposed it are likely apathetic about reunification being plausible. These statistics that they mentioned don't measure the desire to unify. They just measure the willingness of people to trade off money and political power for specific purposes of unification. That was the thing they were not nuanced about. I'm going to quickly refute what they said. They said that they protect sovereignty of South Korea, that North Korea has a terrible economy, all of that. We think for three reasons why this doesn't make sense. First, without your reunification, you literally live next to a literal nuclear superpower that every single day threatens to kill you and all of your population and your entire existence. But secondly, South Korean power is literally waning right now. They have lower birth rates than North Korea. They are losing material benefits. Their chaebols cannot continue to live under a society which has very little amounts of birth rates and very little amount of natural resources. But also, they have a lot of nationalism. So we don't buy into their characterization that people don't want to reunify, because we explained to you why people want reunification. The second argument I'm going to deal with our clash. First, we think that this increases the risk of war. We think abandoning our policy of reunification heightens tensions and increases the risk of armed conflict. What would a shift in policy look like? We think this largely looks like mirroring the North Korean policy. The Armistice Agreement of 1953 between North Korea and South Korea is not a peace treaty. The two regimes are technically still at war. Recognizing North Korea as its own independent nation does not suddenly lead to a peace treaty, just as North Korea recognizing us as an independent state would not lead to a peace treaty either. We think this dismantles all infrastructure towards reunification on their side of the house. Because as they concede, you have to close all government departments like Ministry of Reunification and the thousands of employees and billions of dollars in funding put towards these strategies for peace. The funding and labor employees are not likely going to be redirected towards tax cuts, social services, or anything other than the military, because of the fact that these individuals work as specialized in the military. We think the military has new plans, bases, infrastructure, etc. Because of new geopolitical positioning, they need to inject an injection of cash and bureaucrats. The political climate of South Korea is likely to be very tense because they abandoned the idea of reunification, with many calling for greater investment in military and defense against potential hostilities by the public. The employees themselves are trained and educated in Korean potential affairs, meaning they're likely transferred to foreign affairs departments to deal with North Korea and the military. How would North Korea view this in this specific instance? We think this will be viewed as extremely hostile act and another step towards division, miscommunication, and seclusion. North Korean regime will obviously, of course, see larger investments and dedication to the military as an escalation that will feel the need to respond to, building up border areas and increasing the military arsenal. Even if we don't have a massive investment into the military on propositions world, we will still see the abandonment of established policies and rhetoric surrounding peace as an escalation that is worthy of a response. This decreases the ability for two sides to reach any sort of communication, as hostilities worsen and statements of intent are not able to be relayed between South Korea and North Korean soldiers and the border, let alone the leadership between two countries. The risk of hostility breaking out into violence is increased. Even if it is not large scale, it looks like South Korean soldiers needlessly dying because of increased military tensions. Even if no conflict breaks out, in their best case scenario, South Korea will be investing even more of its energy and efforts into resources towards defense instead of improving the quality of life of citizens that proposition side seems to care so much about. How would North Korea view the continuation of the status quo? On our side of the house, the North Korean regime is likely to implement its new policies as they have planned. But we think that for the reasons I'm going to give, North Korea doesn't actively actually want war. This is just another way for them to actively scare South Korea. Neither side can claim to know exactly what North Korea's eventual goal is or Kim Jong-un's intentions. Only know that what they have done so far, which is closing all reunification-related governmental matters. We don't claim that their plan is peaceful, and it will likely involve investing into more North Korea's military. But due to our continued peaceful reunification strategy, the North Korean military will perceive a larger threat that they have to deal with by investing even more. That means that we don't deal with this as bloated of the North Korean military than on side proposition, wherein we have to match the military spending and output and can't invest on other services that people really want. So you have less likely to have miscommunication on our side and increased military tensions on their side that can lead to escalating levels of conflict and spending necessity on militaries. So you have less support within South Korea. We think those impacts were extremely bad. This is backlash domestically, and that South Korea's elections are very soon. We think this is going to have a lot of impacts. I'll take a POI.
What is this peaceful reunification strategy, and why is it possible on your side?
The peaceful reunification strategy, as you pointed out, it spends a lot of money onto this. This is our second argument on why there's going to be effective planning for reunification. I'll get right to that. We think that there's going to be effective planning for reunification on our side. Retaining our reunification policy right now ensures South Korea will be prepared for the long-term changes in geopolitics. Because if the border walls and demilitarized zone someday fell, how would negotiations between North and South actually happen? Recognize that while it may be hard to imagine the border between North Korea and South Korea disappearing, it is not impossible. Many said the same about the Berlin Wall and the reunification of East and West Germany until one day the wall suddenly fell. We're going to give you structural reasons why this will happen for 3 reasons. Number one, North Korea rejecting reunification actually shows it is weakening in its power. And using these strongman images is the only way for Kim Jong-un to hold onto his power, right? But secondly, North Korea's safety still derives in large part from the Americans' belief that an attack on its territory would result in the immediate devastation of Seoul. This belief is naturally undermined by the suspicion that North Korea is too nationalist, too intent on unification, and too serious about wiping out millions of fellow Koreans. That's why they're using these strategies right now, but we don't think they're actually intent on doing it. But third, reunification happens when a stronger country automatically absorbs a weaker one, such as East and West Germany. Kim Jong-un doesn't obviously want to lose his power. Thus, North Korea's best survival strategy would be a complete political legal break from South Korea. And when Kim Jong-un dies eventually, he's likely to leave massive power vacuum. He's consolidated all of this power. We don't know whether or not the person who's inherit his control will be able to control all of this power. Additionally, we think reunification will be peaceful because we think that a lot of foreign actors are unlikely to involve themselves. China likes it when other countries are docile and nice to each other. They want to eventually take Taiwan. They won't want to get involved into conflicts. So we don't think China was going to staunchly support North Korea anymore just because they're communists, right? How would state officials from both sides of the nation act if borders fell? In either prop or ops world, the actions from North Korea would be the same, as they do not have plans for reunification or reconciliation. So we think that the leaders who are actually going to be on our side of the world, who are going to be pushing forward reunification policies, are going to be South Koreans, because we think that North Korean negotiators and policymakers are unorganized. They're looking towards strategies and that their South Korean counterparts have developed. So in proposition world, where South Korea recognizes North Korea as an independent state, peaceful reconciliation policies will exist, but they'll be incredibly limited in scope. So we think that our impact here is that we think potential unification is very important, because in the long run, this would create many benefits for the United Korea. North Korea is very rich in natural resources. We think that North Korea has a far higher birth rate than South Korea. So even in the possibility reunification occurs, we win this debate, because it means we reap those massive benefits on our side of the house. If it was even possible for that future, we oppose this notion. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker very much for that fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the second speaker from side government to continue the line today's debate. Here.
Hi, can I check that I'm audible?
Perfectly audible.
Great. I'll take my PYs verbally, so just unmute if you have any. The problem with the opposition is that they convey an even if tier with a concession. Our argument was that in the unlikely instance that reunification does occur, it is still bad. We took them at their best case, but they barely proved that. Don't take our credibility for granted. There are two questions in this debate. First, on the viability and desirability of reunification, and second, on aggression and peace. First, on the viability and desirability of reunification. The first thing I want to point out here is that their first speaker does a very sneaky trick. He sets the burden in this debate very low for himself. He says, all they have to prove is that reunification will eventually happen down the line. No, it needs to happen while the meager 100,000 people who survived the Korean War are still around in the next 20 years. Because the new generation is not a country of people who know a reunified Korea and who desire it because they never knew those people in the first place. The premise of the case, therefore, is that reunification will eventually happen. Let's take them at the best and rebut it. There are three reasons why it's unlikely that reunification happens. The first is that Kim has to give up power in order for the two states to merge into one. He's very unlikely to do that because that is not any of his incentives. Second, he has to renege on a public statement that he made that he doesn't want reunification to happen, which is highly embarrassing for him and weakens his own power. Third, their model is that North Korea has to collapse for this happen. Why is this not possible? Their assertion is that Kim is weakening in power. They give you no reasons, no examples to provide that as the case. That is not quite true. In many cases, he's able to use the entirety of the state apparatus to crack down on anyone who wants to contest his power. But even then, North Korea is actually internally politically very stable. The reason why is because the entirety of the political elite, where the power is concentrated, which has the power to crack down on the people, is very loyal to Kim. There are two reasons. One, the Songmun system means that elites are rewarded with privileges that make them unlikely to rebel. Second, the Byungjin policy means that the military is the same size as the public service, and generals are very loyal to Kim. But even economically, North Korea is actually pretty stable because China, in many cases, supports North Korea and gives it huge amounts of funding. I'll prove my argument why they have an incentive to do so. But just note here that North Korea is poor. That doesn't mean that they're unstable or volatile. But violence and poverty that the North Korean government can freely use because there are no democratic elections means that the people are generally kept too weak and too fearful to revolt. Their last case scenario then is that Kim Jong-un will eventually die. First of all, this is not a time frame that they can support in this debate because that will take up to 5 decades, during which time reunification will no longer become a desirable goal at all for any single Korean person. But this is not true. Kim Jong-un, even if he dies, has succession plans, his daughter or his sisters, for instance, and he has an incentive to set that, like every single North Korean leader that came before him, because he also knows that if he dies and doesn't set a successor, there'll be a power vacuum. So this is out of this debate. I'll deal with China in my argument and flag you where I get there. Where I want to push them, therefore, is that they have to definitively prove you beyond any reasonable doubt in this debate why reunification is possible, because that is the premise of the case. But observe the strategy of our first two arguments. We don't have to definitively prove to you that reunification is not possible, because we took them at their best right from first speaker. Even if you give them all of this material that is not proven, even if you assume that it is possible, it is a very, very undesirable thing. On this, they give us very little engagement. The only thing they say is that it's bad for South Korea for reunification to not happen. First of all, this doesn't prove the converse, but I'm going to respond to the mechanisms. They say, without reunification, you live next to a nuclear power. One, this is hinged on reunification being possible. It is very uncomparative. The weighing is that if on both sides it's impossible, at the very least on our side, we can prepare by ramping up preparations. But second of all, this doesn't matter, because even though South Korea has nuclear power, even though North Korea has nuclear power, South Korea is included under the United States nuclear umbrella, which means North Korea is unable to strike first because of mutually assured destruction. Second, they say South Korea's power is waning. This is very tense to their case, because they cannot claim simultaneously that South Korea is declining economically, and simultaneously South Korea can somehow afford the entire cost of absorbing a very poor state into their country. So they need to clean that concession up by the next speaker. But let's just respond to this assertion at face value. Is it true that South Korea's power is waning? No, they have strong electronics and cultural exports. They have a booming economy. It is the miracle on the Han River. This is just a ridiculous assertion. And this even then is uncomparative, because just because they are weaker than they were before doesn't mean that they are weak enough, that they are weaker than North Korea. So they need to respond to the next speaker to all about economic and political reasons as why reunification is undesirable. Their comparisons to East and West Germany, where the income gap was far lower than 22-1 in Korea, don't win them this debate. Next, on aggression and peace. Their first argument is that we increase war. Just to be clear, neither side has the incentive to do so. Let's engage on South Korea's incentives. They claim that South Korea has an incentive to become more aggressive. One, this is internally contradictory, because they cannot simultaneously say that South Koreans see the North Koreans as their people and one reunification, and then say that overnight with this policy, they will suddenly see them as an enemy. So they need to reconcile that. But second of all, their premises don't lead to that conclusion, because there are two alternatives that South Korea can pick. It is not only aggression that they can pursue. They can also just leave North Korea alone. Their alternative of aggression is highly unlikely, for the reason that they themselves say that aggression is very expensive. It requires a human cost and a huge cost to the defense budget. These are unnecessary costs that they don't otherwise have to incur if they just leave North Korea alone. But second of all, neither side wants reunification, neither North Korea nor South Korea. So there's no incentive to be aggressive, because it gets them nowhere. The only reason why the Korean War is still persisting is because South Korea still wants to claim North Korea as part of their country. So their case is not only internally tense, it is just not true. But this assumes they're comparative, which is that reunification is peace. I'm going to prove to you why the uncomparative assumption is out of this debate. The current situation panel, even before North Korea opposed reunification, was that they adopted policies like sinking South Korea's naval vessels, like bombarding their islands. All of these things prove to you that their comparative is not one of peace either. So they need to do two things. One, prove to us definitively why this is the alternative that South Korea will take with actual structural reasoning and incentive analysis. Next, they need to prove that their comparative is better. Neither they have done in this debate. That argument then others incentivizes China to stop funding North Korea. And I want to note that at the beginning of this argument, that this actually engages with a lot of the material that they have. So I'm continuing to clash. The premise here is that China does not actually want to be stuck funding North Korea. But before I explain why, sure, I'll take the POI.
If there's no chance for revolution or uprising because the people are truly too poor, why does North Korea still propagandize and use these tests to show a good image?
Because they want to make sure that in the long term, they are able to retain their power. And this fits into our argument, by the way, which is that 70 years of propaganda have led the Korean people and the North Korea to think they are not one country and these are people who are their enemies. So they need to deal with that. North Korea right now is significantly weaker than China. They get far more from China than China receives in return, because internationally, China doesn't benefit either. North Korea has very little geopolitical power or influence. So if North Korea has nothing to offer China, why do they keep funding them? The only remaining reason is that if the North Korean regime is weak, it is prone to collapse. And once they collapse, as they suggest, they'll be absorbed by a pro-unification South Korean government, putting a US ally right on China's border. Our comparative is this. The moment both North and South Korea abandon reunification, the collapse of North Korea will no longer have any real implication on Chinese national security, since South Korea has no impetus to then absorb North Korea. The upshot is this. Without Chinese substance, North Korea and Kim can no longer survive crippling pressure of US and Western sanctions. Look, 90% of North Korea's current funding comes from China, they can only ignore the pressure of sanctions from the West because of Chinese funding. Now, they must reform for a baseline level of substance. The likely outcome is that on our side, North Korea is willing to reduce their nuclear stockpile, for instance, or disarm, like the US has been pressuring them to do. This is strategically crucial. In the long term, it means North Korea becomes more functioning. It liberates the people. But we get more long-term peace, which is the outcome that they never prove. So we must hear a response by the next speaker. At the end of this, therefore, they need to engage non-evenness and prove beyond any doubt why reunification is possible within the next 20 years. Two broken halves don't make a whole. Propose.
Great, I'd like to thank the speaker very much for that fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the second speaker from side opposition to continue their line today's debate here.
Hello, am I audible? Sorry. Okay, we are audible. All right.
Yep, you're audible.
I'm gonna keep my camera off, and I'm really sorry about that. Like, you guys were lagging during the first speech. The Wi-Fi didn't get better, so I'm gonna keep it off. So hopefully you guys can hear me. Let me set up real quick. All right. I think I'm good. Before I start my speech, I'd also like to thank Chairman. From the very get-go, proposition was incredibly unstrategic and the kinds of arguments they wanted to run. At the very top of their first speaker, they conceded that reunification could be a possibility. And the reason they did this was actually implicit. None of their harms occur unless the reunification happens in the first place. Let's just list out their harms. They say that in the vast majority of times, if this happens, this means there will be huge costs because people are poor. They say that North Koreans will oppose this because they're brainwashed by propaganda. Look, there's no harm to that unless these people are already engaging with each other. At this point, I think there's an implicit concession in opposition that if their impacts of their first argument are to happen, there is necessarily a logical prerequisite, which is that the reunification has to happen. We would say, if this is the case, that within their own argument, they're picking out the most marginal and uncomparative parts of this claim. Sure, maybe at first, they're brainwashed by propaganda. But when they're no longer starving, when they're no longer forced and held by the inhumane rules that exist in North Korea, I doubt that is actually going to be the case. Don't let them pull out very specific impacts. Look at the broader scope of things. We would say both in the short run and the long run that these things are incredibly
information
for both people, and I think they'll be able to recognize it. The rest of their case is literally 30 seconds long on further conflict. I think we spent significantly more time on this. I'd like to do three things in this speech. The first, deal with their responses towards our claims. The second, respond to every single claim they get, every single claim we get outside opposition. And then lastly, I'm going to deal with a proposition. And lastly, I'm going to give a new argument about why there's less support from the West. Firstly, on their responses towards our claim. We told you that there was a long-term plan for possible reunification. And notice what the implication of this argument was. It's not that it needed to be immediate. It's that we should always keep this possibility open because the benefits are so large. If there's even a chance that we can prove that this is possible, we would say that the reunification of a new Korea is actually the best that we can have in any status quo. What do they respond? They say that this needs to happen within a specific time frame because you need the support of people who survived in the Korean War. No, you don't. If you can convince people that the birth rate is declining, that you no longer have natural resources, and tell them about the benefits that Michael just told you, I think there's actually significantly quite a lot of support within South Korea. And furthermore, I actually think there's a lot of actions you can take in order to gain support from the South Koreans. So for instance, you can push this as a solution to many of their problems. You can also talk about why the separation is actually incredibly, incredibly dangerous. Don't buy their claim.
Point of information.
that most people in South Korea don't support this. There's still like 69% of people within South Korea. Sure, the number is declining, but if you want to pursue reunification, you pursue policies that increases that percentage. The second response they get is Kim will not want to do this. We fully agree. Our mechanism never relied on this. Their response afterwards is that Kim will not set a successor. No, thank you. And that is going to be very bad. Let's just list a couple more alternatives that might happen. Firstly, elites might not have the same views as Kim. So sure, he has successors, but all the military coups and all the coups that has happened within that family has been within the family in the first place. Look, they don't have to share the same views. It is very uncharitable for proposition to assert these elites are obviously always going to follow in the same views as Kim. Secondly, there can be financial support from China that disappears when they no longer have any kinds of power over South Korea. There's actually disproportionate leverage in which North Korea's economy will be reliant on other sources. This is why the first time reunification happened, it came so close. Like, I don't remember in the 1900s, I forget the date. But the reason for that is because there's actually not a choice for North Korea. When the economy is falling, if China no longer wants to support them, then they have to rely on someone else. They would have to turn to South Korea. The last, look, maybe soldiers can defect en masse. We didn't have to prove that this argument was necessary. We had to prove that it was likely at some point in the future. And the implication of this was incredibly huge because it meant that we were able to reap all the benefits of them being together. It means we could reap the benefits of massive like changes in the ability of people to have children because the birth rate is currently declining in South Korea. It means we have access to natural resources. It means that people in North Korea have access to the economy of South Korea. Notice, the response of the POI actually suggests from proposition that there is a risk. This is incredibly important here because they already conceded in their POI that we need propaganda because there's a risk of reunification. We would say that is a great risk and we actually would want that to happen. The second claim they get, the second piece of response they get is on this idea of increased tensions. They say there's a tense characterization on ours of the House. No, there isn't. The characterization depends on varying time frames. On ours of the House, if it is an immediate impact, we would say this actually increases tensions. But throughout the long run, we can prepare for benefits in order to reunify. This is not a tense characterization. The second thing they say is it doesn't have to be aggressive policy, and this can be, and this won't be viewed as aggressive. Look, this didn't deal with our argumentation and was solely an assertion. We told you why North Korea is already against South Korea. In fact, first proposition already conceded this, that in North Korea saying they don't want to actually reunify anymore, they're heavily against South Korea. But secondly, a rapid change in militarization is a reason why North Korea views this as incredibly hostile. When they have the independence, we think about, and you actually view them as an independent state, they believe that they have the ego to act. They're more willing to use the weapons they've prepared. They're more willing to disproportionately militarize even more. That is incredibly harmful. Let's deal with their responses, their arguments down the bench. The first thing they say, actually, before I do that, I'll take a POI.
Saying that South Korea needs more economic growth is different from saying that South Korea needs North Korea. You have to deal with the fact that there's education spending on welfare, and everything that is included.
They have a declining birth rate and they have a lack of natural resources. We would say these are benefits we already talked about that POI doesn't engage. They say that there's a sovereignty of North Korea that gets harmed. I think our case already implicitly beat this. Let's go line by line. They say that this is going to have huge costs and that people are poor. In the long run, there are massive benefits to this. We told you about the economic benefits. We told you about the increase in birth rates. We told you about the natural resources. We told you about the access to chaebols. These are incredibly important because it means in the long run, the economy develops. They then respond that North Korea is brainwashed by propaganda. Look, North Koreans can access information. They have things like radio signals, like Chinese citizens conducting trade, like just word of mouth between citizens, or even balloons with USB sticks. Whichever it is, we think they have access to information. But secondly, at the point in which you abandon them, you actually justify the propaganda that they talk about themselves. We would say this drives the North Korean citizens towards their government because they think that the government is now their only hope. This has more support for violent policies and less defectors that is probably good for us in the House. The last thing, so at the end of this, we would say that things are able to change over time. In the long run, don't let Singapore overlook the economic benefits. The last claim on further conflict was responded to implicitly. Last argument then on why we're able to get less support from the West in case of this policy. How is this policy perceived by the West? We would say this means that South Korea makes a decision against Western values. So this gives the North Korea independence, which the US doesn't want to do, and it also allows them the ability to act more violently by recognizing them as a state. Two cases, because there's an upcoming election. This is bad for both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. The first, For Joe Biden, his decisions are heavily scrutinized because the US media is going to likely portray this as bad, given that you're making a massive concession. What this means is that people on the ground that make up the vast majority of political will get mad that the US is funding a country that goes against their values. They would rather the US spend money on their domestic issues. We think this means that you get less funding within South Korea. But the second, in terms of Donald Trump, he's already very anti-interventionist, and this is made very clear by his policies with Ukraine. We would say that he is also likely to pull out given this new change. We think, in fact, all of the Western countries are likely going to follow this. They're not going to support it, given the US no longer supports it. They generally follow similar views. At the end of this, we would say that in the very worst case, you still get significantly reductions in military support and bases and a lot less funding. We're very proud then to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to give the floor.
Hi, can I be seen and heard?
Yep.
Great. I'll take verbal POIs. So the problem that second opposition points out is that South Korea has low birth rates and no natural resources. And their logical solution is that we need to absorb North Korea. This is absolutely absurd. I think there are a lot of other ways to make sure that South Korea has to retain economic dominance. For instance, using an advanced economy as it has now, relying on AI and things like that. The problem with the opposition case is they have never proven why economic declination means that we need to absorb North Korea. Do you know who else has slow economic growth? The US. Does that mean the US should absorb Mozambique? No, they need to give us a clear justification of why this policy is unique and needed. They haven't done so. I think it's a bit too late in third opposition. I want to ask 3 questions in this speech. 1, what does reunification actually look like on their side? 2nd, is this economically viable? 3rd, on aggression. First, what is their peaceful reunification strategy that they harp on since first? They say that when Kim Jong-un falls, there will be a power vacuum. This is blatantly false and doesn't cohere with reality because Kim Jong-un's daughter, Kim Joo-ae, has already been put into place as the next as the next leader if Kim Jong-un dies. They say, well, at the very least, there'll be a power vacuum because the elites and generals don't have loyalty to her. That isn't true. They have loyalty to Kim family because of the analysis that Houghton tells you. And more than that, we tell you that Kim's family already has huge amounts of support. Look, the problem with the opposition case is they don't engage why elites and generals would necessarily stop an uprising or try to create a power vacuum when they already live in the richest parts of North Korea, when they already have the best education and employment opportunities. They don't do enough legwork to prove this claim. So what do they need to support on their side? 1, they either need to support an aggressive push from South Korea. This is bad because this means that North Korea will view South Korea as hostile. Look at Kim's rhetoric recently. Kim says that if South Korea tries to invade on its territory and sovereignty, they will be willing to fight back and aggress. This flips their claim of aggression. But this also means that we don't concede that our case is fully on the assumption that reunification is impossible. The very advocacy of it worsens aggression. Or 2nd, that both sides agree, but obviously it's not possible because North Korea doesn't want reunified Korea. So their burden also explains why reunification was possible. They haven't done so right now. Second clash, is this economically viable? The strategic implication of this clash is this. They need to show that reunification is possible because South Korea can only ask for reunification in name, but not in practice. So what did this advocacy for reunification actually look like? And I want you to imagine the cost to average citizen, because the cost to the average East German was an additional 5.5% to their income tax. Now, multiply that by 7 because the income tax between North Korea and South Korea is 22-1 and not 3-1. And what you get is economic devastation for the average citizen. So I dare cite opposition to tell the average citizen in South Korea that our impact was uncomparative and marginal, because I think for these individuals, it was a very comparative and very high level impact. So they needed an answer to the millions of citizens. They needed an answer on how they were going to fund this, because North Korea had a poverty rate of 60%. They had economically inefficient systems and they had high levels of corruption. They need a huge sum of money to try and fund this, to reunite these 2 countries. They haven't done so right now. The next thing I want to deal with under this clash is on this statistic battle. They say, well, most people actually want reunification, just that they don't think it's possible. Here's the statistic and here's the problem in their case. 72% of South Koreans believe that reunification is unnecessary because they rather focus on things like employment and housing. The problem is that when reunification continues to happen on their side as a domestic policy, you crowd out other discussions on domestic policies like housing, like the low birth rates that their side talks about, like employment and job opportunities. So on their side, the South Korean citizens don't care about reunification because it costs so much money to try and spend it on the ministries on reunification, on the reunification tax. You don't focus on the actual problems that affect their daily lives. So this is the weighing on the average South Korean citizen. Because it's an act of motion, this is important in the debate. Now then, I want to extend the margin. Why is North Korea economically unviable and therefore doom South Korea even if it's economically slow now? A few reasons. One, because it's high upfront costs, because you need to implement huge amounts of welfare to support the 60% of North Koreans that are under the global poverty line. Second, because South Korea relies on the advanced economy. It's about cultural exports, it's about electronics. Compare that to North Korea's economically inefficient agricultural and industrial plants. South Korea then was to spend huge amounts of money upskilling these workers, fixing the economic inefficiencies within the system, and spending huge amounts of money on infrastructure and manufacturing. Our point is simple, that on our side, South Korea does not need to incur these costs, and there are far easier ways to ensure economic growth. For instance, collaborating with the US that has been likely and has been happening in the status quo, which I'll continue to prove later on in my speech. Therefore, at the end of this clash, I've proven two things. One, that it's economically unviable because it costs huge amounts of money. And second, that this money affects the average South Korean citizen, and it costs huge amounts of money to them and their taxpayer money. They need an answer to these citizens. They haven't provided one yet. Last clash then on aggression. There are two main prongs under this clash. The first prong was on living in fear, and the second was on re-aggression from both South Korea and North Korea. First, on living in fear, the problem with this argument is they don't explain the tipping point. Why is it likely that when South Korea declares that it does not want to reunify with North Korea, then South Korean citizens will then live in fear? Because guess what? North Korea's rhetoric is really they don't view South Korea as part of its own country, they view South Korea and its citizens as hostile. So I think this is a wash at best. But I want to flip this argument. The reason why South Korean citizens are like to live in fear far more on their side of the house, because North Korea are more likely to take active steps to prevent against a possible South Korean invasion. And this is the mindset and rhetoric that Kim has talked about over the past few weeks. So on their side of the house, the average South Korean citizen lives in fear. Don't let them get away with their fluffy rhetoric with no analysis. Next, they talk about aggression. And over here, there's no weigh both mechanisms that both sides present. Their side's mechanism is that South Korea is like to increase the military budget and like to increase the number of personnel sent to the military. Why? I have no idea. Weigh that against our claim that North Korea already thinks it's sovereign and therefore is more likely to aggress when South Korea continues to try to impede on its territory. I think one claim is far more analytical. I think one claim is far more likely. But here's why South Korea does not need to spend far more on its military on our side of the house. The reason is this, that on our side, South Korea can choose two things. Either A, put its personnel into the military as their side claims, or B, simply leave North Korea alone, because they've never proven why both countries leaving each other alone is a possible solution. We told you this in first and revived it in second, we had no response. So on our side of the house, South Korea has no incentive to aggress because it already heeds North Korea's demands of no reunification. So that's why it's on our side of the house, we reduce aggression. Notably, they strategically deals with their arguments on reducing taxpayer money, on having increase in tax cuts, and reducing in social services. So you cannot let them get away with these impacts. What then happens on our side of the house? And here's why Hao Tian's second speaker argument was crucial. Because Hao Tian's second speaker argument tells you that it's only on our side of the house that we incentivize China to stop funding North Korea. Before I explain what is likely, is there a POI? Seeing none, why then is it likely that we incentivize China to stop funding North Korea? And the reason for this is simple, because China only funds North Korea because it's scared of a South Korean invasion and a US-backed Korea Peninsula. On our side, when South Korea stops having its plans of reunification, China is less likely to fund North Korea. What this means then, and the impact of this is large, is that North Korea is like to do things like reduce its nuclear personnel and military because it has to try to get the US to lift its sanctions because it cannot only rely on China. This argument is important because we prove we reduce aggression on the onset because North Korea has no more funding from its other egregious actor of China. So this also flips their argument on aggression. No response in second is damning for their third speaker. I think it's a bit too late to respond. Lastly, I want to do the third argument on decrease in support from the US. Two reasons why this is untrue. One, the US is likely to fund South Korea militarily because it wants to guard against possible North Korea retaliation. Second, the US still has economic support for South Korea because it's important economically, because the West Sea in South Korea, it leads to important import routes to Taiwan, and Japan also can act as a buffer against China. Both these reasons show that it's important to the US, so they won't do it. Our comparative was almost simple. It was one of peace talks without reunification clauses that their side never responded to. So at the end of this speech, our strategy was very simple. We never needed to prove that reunification was possible. We proved that one, if it happens, it is bad. That two, the very advocacy of it leads to far more harms and aggression. It is for this reason two broken halves cannot make a whole. Propose.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to look forward to the third speaker from side of the opposition to continue the line today's debate. Here.
Okay, am I audible to everyone?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'll take PI's review, please. Panel, let's look at the inferred preference in the status quo. It is very absurd for proposition in this debate to try to claim that South Korea thinks reunification is a bad idea if it is possible, given that they've attempted this for decades. The only instance where reunification is bad is if it fails. But per second prop's own analysis, that North Korea's weakening was possible on their side of the house because China will stop funding them, that is justification for why reunification will be successful because South Korea can have more power over them. Independence does not imply peace. All the reasons for why conflict and counterbalance incentives between North and South Korea will still exist. We think that the power for North Korea to act on those bad incentives will be higher in their side. I'm going to answer 3 questions in this speech. Number 1, what does reunification actually look like? I think this should wash out the majority of their claim. Second, is reunification a popular ideology? And lastly, is reunification a good idea if it is actually successful? First clash, what does reunification actually look like? This should wash out the majority of their claim, because we do not have to prove that reunification is possible now, but rather that it is possible in the future if we keep on attempting it. There's 2 things I'm going to do under this clash. Number 1, I'm going to prove to you why in the future will be successful for the exact reason that they tell us. The premise is this. North Korea is being weakened right now in the status quo. The first reason that we give you this, and this is the only reason that they responded to down the bench, is that when Kim dies, the country faces instability. But even if you buy all the refutation on this argumentation, the other reason that we gave you was that firstly, there's population within North Korea that gets more angry as outside information seeps in. The fact that with rising and escalating conflict, when South Korea keeps on pushing the idea unification, there's a greater likelihood that this population is going to know. But the last reason that we give you is that sanctions are going to get tougher as as North Korea keeps on using all of their nuclear weapons. The fact that between 2017 and 2019, North Korea's economy decreased by a total of 10%. What this means is that it takes less confrontation within the process of reunification in the future. So for instance, maybe things like offering economic benefits is sufficient. South Korea doesn't need to make sacrifice, and it's not that costly, we think, that refutes the majority of their claim. We also think that South Korea wouldn't unethically take advantage North Korea's weakened status to impose things like disadvantageous conditions on North Korea out of consideration that this will be a unified country that needs to be holistically functional. This means that even if what proposition says about things like wealth disparity is true, there will be efforts addressed to worsen those domestic problems. And given the analysis we gave you on the high birth rates that North Korea has, this will be something that is politically palatable in the future. And lastly, even if actual reunification wouldn't happen on our side of the house, taking them at their best, negotiations still would be more and more possible in the future because North Korea is forced to come to the table and actually discuss it. Will be put at a disadvantage. We think this is a far better reason for negotiation compared to a world in which they have sovereignty and an ability and a right to not negotiate. The second thing I'm going to prove under this clash is why reunification is actually necessary for peace in the very first place. The characterization is that peace is the only way to obtain trust from the global stage. when South Korea successfully unifies with North Korea, it means that the US military leaves South Korea. It means that China stops viewing South Korea as an opposition force. South Korea is no longer on the brink of war. We think this is generally good. This is the reputation that we have to the third argument. China doesn't have tension, the reason why China will still be engaging in conflict isn't going to fall on their side of the house. North Korea is still a military actor that is capable of sending nukes to South Korea and is a neighbor that actually poses a threat. So we think the same problem, even if fighting their characterization, will still happen on their side. But here's the weighing here. Why is war and violence a greater threat than the concerns that proposition proposes about domestic instability? There's two reasons here. The first reason is that you have control over domestic well-being, but you have no control over North Korea once they become independent, so the risk is automatically higher on their side. But the second reason is on capacity, right? North Korea is under global condemnation for its massive usage of nuclear weapons. Per their own argumentation that counter interests between North and South Korea will always exist, the capacity for North Korea to commit acts of violence in a world in which they have independence and have the justification for that to use things like nuclear weapons will be higher on their side. We think violence and security is the utmost priority for South Korea. I think we take that clash. But the second clash here is for unification a popular ideology. What they keep on pushing that South Korea citizens don't actually want reunification. But there's two reasons that we give you down the bench as to why this is untrue. The first thing to note here is that the reason why statistics is not a good measure of desire to reunify is because the opposition against reunification is because of a lack of belief over the success. But also, we just think that opinions are highly likely to change in the future. And the reason for this is because North Korea is weakening, that we get nationalism that strengthens, that support will be more credible in the future. That is a reason as to why South Korean citizens will be more likely to support this act. But here's the thing, panel. You know what would be a better way to represent the people on the ground is if political agendas are no longer centered around never-ending debate on whether North Korea will reunify or not, where you get more policy making that caters to domestic well-beings and not South Korea's relationship with North Korea after reunification has actually happened. On our side of the house, we give you structural analysis on whether there is a strong belief within reunification to begin with. One, that people were taught in schools that North Korea and South Korea should be together. That nationalism is actually prevalent against the concept that reunification should not happen. That's the reason as to why we should get reunification and people generally support it. But the second thing to note here is that North Korea has many benefits in the very first place. So things like natural resources that South Korea doesn't necessarily have. So reunification will actually bring benefits. The last thing is that people do not want to live under danger. They say that people fear danger more on their side of the house. They gave us no structural analysis. It is very unclear as to why this is the case, where independence for North Korea means a greater security threat. We think this is incredibly important. Last clash then, is reunification a good idea? They give us three things under this. The first thing is that without reunification and independence, you get more negotiation. But this is not true, because independency isn't the only threshold for negotiation in the very first place. The fact that there are other reasons for why conflict exists is a proof for why negotiation probably wouldn't happen on their side. It is only in a world in which North Korea is weakened would negotiation actually be possible. But even if South Korea recognizes independency and we get policies, it's probably going to be limited in the very first place. The second argument is on cost, that this will be incredibly costly and not advantageous for South Korea. But firstly, as mentioned earlier, the weakening of North Korea requires not that much sacrifice in the very first place. But the second argument to note here, and the very crucial thing to point out, is that in refuting our second argument, they ignore our first argument on mirroring North Korea's policy, that the spending exists on their side on self-defense. So things like military, because they view North Korea as a greater threat. So the weighing here is not which side spends less, but what the money is actually spent on. Why is spending on reunification a better idea than spending on military? Three reasons. One, spending on the military increases tension, which is incredibly risky. Secondly, the benefit is more widespread, that the reunification contributes to positive developments that we think is very important. But then lastly, reunification pays off in the long run. That the military does nothing but cause death, whereas on our side of the house, it invests into the long term. We think that is actually more preferable and advantageous. The last thing they give us in their third argument is that China is going to stop funding North Korea, and therefore North Korea is going to be weakened. But this argument is contingent on the fact that conflict de-escalates when independence happens, which is unlikely. But we also think that that ignores our stance. We think that China has incentives to keep on funding North Korea for the exact reason that they don't want violence happening in their backyards when they're terrified, when they keep on considering and wanting to invade Taiwan. We also give you the last argument, which is on Western support that is mitigated on their side that they never engaged with. We tell you why the West has an incentive to actively help South Korea, on our side, help more, when they can use South Korea as a means to combat North Korea. We think that is the actual benefit that South Korea, and this is the only positive impact that we get in this round. We're very proud to propose.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for the fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the upper reply to end their today's debate. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, great. I'll begin on my first word. Panel, you cannot win a debate off refutation. And by third, not a single mechanism nor impact was brought back by Team Singapore. I think this heavily speaks to their ability to actually construct a real case in this round. They cannot respond and win off claims like we can use artificial intelligence to fix birth rates instead. They can't win based on using South Korean citizens getting scared as their ultimate impact. We would say that the point which our claim is probably the strongest in this debate, we're very likely to win. Couple things then I would like to talk about. The first on the strategic implications of proposition stance, and then three themes. The first on tensions, the second on possible reunification, and the last on US and China. Firstly, on their strategy. It was incredibly unstrategic for proposition to hinge the vast majority of impacts on reunification actually happening. They say that if reunification happens, then XYZ thing is likely also going to happen. We pointed out, and notably this was unresponded to, that if reunification happens, other more greater things in the greater scheme of things are probably more likely to happen. Things like economic growth, things like fixing the birth rate. This meant that they had to respond to our claim in order for their claim to work. They didn't do so. Let's talk about tensions. This claim out of our case was about the short-term impacts. It was about the immediate reaction of what you do when you now recognize North Korea as an independent state. Notably, this was a guaranteed impact in the short run. That when you impose the policy that proposition wants to say, and you recognize North Korea as an independent state, then you actually have to take on certain actions. So we told you that these actions look like turning infrastructure on the border that you normally would have used for reunification efforts, for instead to turning that into the military. You probably have to tear these things down and then turn them into the military. Notably, given that Singapore concedes that there's a lot of spending on this kind of infrastructure, we probably agree. And this means a lot of money into the military. North Korea directly views this as a threat. And this is their justification for arming themselves more. The kinds of propaganda they say to their citizens, the kinds of narratives they now impose within their own individual country. What we think this does is it effectively pushes North Korean citizens further into North Korea. They buy into the regime more. They're more willing to support more extreme acts of militarization and violence. This is the impact of tensions, and it's a result of tearing down the infrastructure that exists for reunification efforts. Our second claim and our second path to victory was in a different time span. It was on the long term, in which we told you that in the long term, if there was any chance of reunification, we would, one, be able to derive far more benefits from that, and second, that they would be significantly easier to achieve in the first place. If we prove this, we win, because in the long term, it completely revolutionizes the kinds of economies we have within the peninsula. What are the responses we get out of third? They say that they can use AI instead. This doesn't target the problems of birth rates and economy. This doesn't target the problems of natural resources. They say that this crowds out policies. Look, policies aren't mutually exclusive, but even if it is, we would say that having established infrastructure and having to tear that down is more expensive than just keeping them that are already existing. We would say that you're already in the past significantly doing this, and this came out of our first speaker. I think they had to deal with this at some point to give this response. The last thing we would say is that at best, even if policies of trade exist on prop, then we outweigh this. Why is this? We told you that these policies of trade probably look like more tourism and cultural exchange when you recognize North Korea as an independent state. You don't get the kinds of massive benefits where you can merge economies and individual people on the ground. You don't get the kinds of changes to the military and humanitarian aid we can actually help people on the ground. You'll never be able to access the benefits that we claim, even at the point in which you pursue the policy the proposition proposes. So what this means is that you functionally give up all of the impacts that are possible at some point, and which they already conceded down the bench is likely going to happen. The last on US-China relations, they never responded to this claim, but even if they did, let's say that it's good that they say that China backs North Korea. Look, out of third, we already told you, this is a good thing. We would say that China actually holds North Korea accountable. In the absence of accountability metrics, they're more likely to send a nuke flying out somewhere into the world. We regret that. We're very, very proud to win this debate.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for that fine speech. I'd like to yield the floor to the Gov reply to end today's debate. Here.
You know, the funny thing is, I actually also live in a country that has low birth rates and few natural resources. Thankfully, that means I know that you don't need to absorb another territory and an impossible pursuit that will leave my government bankrupt and my country internally divided in order to grow. Globalization in the 21st century means you can trade. You no longer need to operate on an economy of coal and copper. Even if there are low birth rates, you can have pro-indigenous policies, like childcare subsidies, for instance. So they need to not just prove that this was good for South Korea, which is intuitively dubious at best. They needed to prove this was the best alternative. That is not a burden they have met in this debate. Opposition's vote was unrealistic, unresponsive, and unstable. Proposition vote was grounded, economically sound, and peaceful. First, on opposition's vote. Their vote was unrealistic because they needed to prove to you why reunification was genuinely possible, but the only model for this was that North Korea would eventually collapse. This required them to, per their own words, propagandize people into wanting to sacrifice their income and stability over decades for a new generation that had no idea what one Korea actually was and didn't genuinely desire these things. So even if people didn't want it, they had to insist on it. But not just that, we explained to you very early on into the debate. Actually, North Korea is pretty politically stable. They have many things that keep their generals, their political elite, allied to Kim. And even then, the people are too weak to genuinely be able to launch any sort of meaningful protest. Beyond that, they're economically stable. They may be poor, but they have China's backing to get above a baseline level of substance. All of these things are not things that they have responded to. They just say that Kim will die eventually. First of all, this is again not a time frame that they can support. But even then, we give you incentives as to why he would naturally institute successors. So this falls out of the debate. Second, and even if tier is not a concession, and I don't want to explain how debate works here, but let's just say we were charitable and we took them at their best. Reunification, even if possible, was just economically bad. In many cases, it meant that South Korea, a pretty good economy as it is right now, had to take over one of the worst economies, if not the worst economy in the world. But beyond that, it was politically very, very disastrous because this is not the reunification of one country. It is the reunification of two territories, one of which has been taught for the past 70 years that these are not their brothers, but they are their enemy, that they caused the war and they are the stubborn and obstinate ones. So they may have engaged on the economy, but on politics, they had absolutely no engagement. There was uncomparative. On the economy, they were uncomparative to other policies. On aggression then, there were two parts, North Korea and South Korea. They told you that North Korea was independent on our side and more uncontrollable. This doesn't engage with the fact that North Korea already declared itself as independent. On their side, they have the same aggression. They need to explain how they control a pariah state. But South Korea wouldn't increase its aggression either, because their own assertion actually undercuts this. If spending is going to increase if they are aggressive, then they wouldn't adopt that alternative. Why not just leave it alone? So at best, they spend more because they antagonize Kim. But we, on our side, we don't spend beyond a necessary amount. Their vote was unproven. They asserted that there'll be negotiations because they're more possible. Why? When North Korea is bankrolled by China that fears a US ally at their borders, why when North Korea was independent on their side as well? They asserted there'll be Western support on their side, but the US would still support South Korea because it isn't worse for the perception to abandon a country in Asia and lose the fight against China. Next, on our vote. Our vote had untouched material, not just responses down the line. That it was politically unpopular and very damaging. That these peace negotiations would be more possible if you decouple peace with reunification. That you further antagonize North Korea when you push a policy that they've declared that they don't want. That when China pulls out, it forces North Korea to concede to sanctions and creates a more long-term sustainable form of peace. Why was this more important? As early as set up, we told you, only 28% of South Koreans still want this. They would spend millions on a policy that nobody even wanted. Second, we told you, we engaged on their best in 2 ways. Even if it was possible, it was still bad, and the process itself was inherently bad. So the assertion that it is not economically expensive doesn't cut them in this debate. It is $3 trillion. It is 175% of South Korea's GDP. They need to engage on where this debate actually was. For all those reasons, two broken halves don't make a whole. Propose.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech.